The front door of the diner swung open hard enough to rattle the glass. She walked in, wearing a black coat, eyes sharp and unreadable, the kind of woman who moved through rooms like she already owned them. She crossed the floor without hesitation, stopped at the counter, and looked directly at the man who had hung up on her exactly 10 minutes ago. The whole room went still as she leaned forward and said quietly, "Who do you think you are to hang up on me?" The man set down his cloth, looked back at her, and didn't move an inch. The diner had been on the corner of Mercer and Fifth for longer than most people in the neighborhood could remember. The sign above the door was faded, the booths were patched at the seams, and the overhead lights hummed at a frequency that never quite let you forget they were there. But the coffee was strong, the food was honest, and the place stayed open until 2 in the morning, which was reason enough for the regulars to keep coming back. Nobody came to Reed's Diner for the atmosphere. They came because it was still there. Nathan Cole had worked the evening shift for almost 3 years. He was the kind of man who didn't take up more space than he needed, not loud, not friendly, in a way that invited questions, just steady. He moved behind the counter with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped thinking about the motions. Refill wipe checked the order tickets move. The other staff left him alone, not out of dislike, but because he gave off the quiet signal of a man who had already sorted things out in his own head and didn't need the conversation. He wasn't from this neighborhood. Anyone who looked at him closely enough could tell there was a precision in the way he carried himself that didn't match the worn linoleum floor or the handwritten specials board above the register. But nobody looked that closely. That was one of the things Nathan had come to appreciate about night shifts at a place like this. Nobody looked that closely. It was a Tuesday just past 9 in the evening when the phone behind the counter rang. Nathan picked it up the way he always did. No greeting, just a flat, "Reed's Diner." The voice on the other end didn't bother with a greeting either, but for a different reason. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge of that location. Right now." The voice was a woman's, clipped, and certain the kind of voice that had spent years being answered immediately. "I'm calling about a private reservation for a meeting this Thursday. It needs to be arranged tonight." Nathan told her the owner wasn't in. He said it plainly without apology. He offered to take a message, or she could call back in the morning when the owner came in after 10. The woman on the other end didn't accept that. She repeated herself not louder, but sharper. She said she didn't have time to call back in the morning, that she needed this handled now, and that she expected someone competent to be available. The word competent landed the way she intended it to. Nathan didn't respond to the word. He said again that the owner wasn't in, that he couldn't authorize a private reservation on the owner's behalf, and that the morning was the earliest he could help her. There was a short silence on the line, the kind that came not from uncertainty, but from someone recalibrating how hard to push. Then she began again, and this time the tone had shifted into something colder, more deliberate. Nathan waited until she reached a natural stop in the sentence. Then he said, "I'll leave a message for the morning," and he put the phone down. Not slammed, not dropped, just set back in its cradle with the same even pressure he would use to set down a coffee cup. He stood there for a moment, then turned back to the counter, picked up his cloth, and went back to work. Across the diner, one of the other staff, a younger man named Derek, who ran the grill on weeknights, had watched the whole thing from the kitchen window. He stared at Nathan for a second, then looked back down at the griddle and said nothing. There were things you questioned and things you didn't. Nathan, hanging up a phone without raising his voice, somehow fell into the second category. The next 10 minutes passed, the way most minutes in a night diner passed, slowly without incident. A couple near the window asked for the check. An older man at the end of the counter nursed his coffee without looking up from the table. The door didn't open. Nathan wiped down the counter in long, even strokes and gave no sign he was thinking about anything at all. Then the headlights swept across the front window. A black car, long, clean, and expensive in the understated way that meant the driver didn't need anyone to know it was expensive, pulled up against the curb directly in front of the diner. The engine cut. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door with the practiced timing of someone who did it 10 times a day. The woman who stepped out wore a black coat over a dark blouse, her hair pulled back with the kind of precision that didn't happen by accident. She looked at the diner sign for exactly 1 second, then walked directly to the front door. The bell above the door made its small, ordinary sound, and everything in the room got quieter. She stopped on the other side of the counter 2 feet from Nathan and looked at him the way someone looks at something they're deciding how to handle. The couple by the window had looked up. The older man at the end of the counter had lifted his eyes from his coffee. Even Derek had found a reason to linger near the kitchen window. "You hung up on me," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation. It was a statement being delivered as a test. Nathan set down his cloth. He met her eyes without any particular urgency and said, "The owner isn't in. That hasn't changed." Adrienne Blake, CEO of Blake Consolidated Logistics, one of the largest private freight networks on the eastern seaboard, stood across a diner counter from a man in an apron who had just repeated himself to her face, calmly without apology, and showed no sign of backing down. She had not expected that. She had positioned herself at the counter the way people position themselves when they intend to win something, standing at full height, coat still on bag, still on her shoulder. She was making it clear she hadn't come to stay. She had come to resolve. "I don't know how much they pay you here," she said, keeping her voice level and businesslike, "but I'm prepared to compensate the owner directly for the inconvenience of a last-minute arrangement. Whatever the number is, I'll double it. I need a private space. I need it Thursday, and I need it confirmed tonight." She placed her card on the counter, matte black, no logo visible from the angle Derek was watching from, and slid it forward. "All I need is a name and a callback number. That's all." Nathan looked at the card. He didn't pick it up. He said he understood what she needed, and he said it again. The owner wasn't in, and he had no authority to confirm anything on the owner's behalf. If she left her contact information, the owner would reach out by 9 in the morning. Adrienne pulled the card back. "That's not going to work for me." "I understand," Nathan said. "That's still the answer." Something shifted behind her eyes, but her face didn't change. She was recalibrating again the way she'd done on the phone, except this time she was doing it in person, and it wasn't working the same way. She had expected him to fold once she was standing in front of him. Most people did. The card alone usually closed things. She looked at him for a moment, not with anger exactly, but with the focused attention of someone trying to locate the mechanism that was supposed to make him move. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. The question was quieter than the others. It wasn't a threat, it was a genuine inquiry into whether he understood what he was dealing with. Nathan said he did. He said her name, Adrienne Blake, Consolidated Logistics, and he said it without emphasis, the way he might read an item off a ticket. Then he picked up his cloth again and moved 2 steps down the counter to wipe a ring left by someone's coffee cup. That stopped her. She had expected either ignorance or intimidation. She had not expected recognition delivered at the same register as a weather report. She watched him wipe the counter and said nothing for a full 3 seconds, which was for Adrienne Blake an unusually long time to say nothing. "Then you understand," she said, "that this isn't a complicated request. This is a business matter, and I'm trying to handle it professionally. I came here in person because I prefer to resolve things directly." Nathan set the cloth down and looked at her again. "You came here because hanging up bothered you," he said. "The reservation is a reason. It's not the reason." The diner was very quiet. Derek had stopped pretending to wipe down the grill. The couple by the window had given up any pretense of their own conversation. Adrienne's jaw tightened just slightly, just enough to be visible if you were watching for it. "You have a lot of confidence for someone in your position," she said. "I'm in a fine position," Nathan said. "Can I get you something while you're here? Coffee's good." It was not sarcasm. That was what made it land the way it did. He meant it plainly. and she could hear that he meant it plainly, and that was worse than if he'd been trying to provoke her. She set both hands flat on the counter, a gesture that looked composed, but wasn't, and lowered her voice. "I will find out who owns this place. I will make one phone call, and I will have a conversation that makes Thursday irrelevant. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Nathan said he understood. Then he said, "Blake Consolidated's Eastern Hub runs out of a warehouse complex in Trenton. The third-party carrier contract on the Northern Corridor, the one signed 18 months ago, it's not a standard freight agreement. The rate structures are designed to look clean on the surface, but they create a compliance gap in the customs documentation cycle. Someone inside your organization built that in on purpose. I don't think it was you." The room didn't change. The lights hummed the same way they always hummed, but Adrienne Blake went very still. She looked at him the way you look at something that has just revealed itself to be something else entirely. Her hands were still flat on the counter. Her voice, when it came, was different in texture, quieter but not softer. "Where did you hear that?" Nathan didn't answer right away. He turned, poured a cup of coffee from the carafe behind the counter, and set it down in front of the empty stool to his left, not in front of her, but close enough to be an invitation. Then he said, "I used to work compliance for a mid-size freight brokerage. 3 years in the industry before I left. I've seen that structure before. I've seen what it's built to do." Adrienne's eyes moved to the coffee cup, then back to him. The calculation behind her expression had changed completely. The version of this conversation she had prepared for the one where she applied pressure, and he relented, was gone. She was in a different conversation now, and she hadn't chosen to be in it. She sat down. Not the way she'd sat down in 1,000 conference rooms, not as a controlled choice, not as a display. She sat down because something had gone out of her legs very slightly, in the way things do when information arrives that rearranges what you thought you knew. She didn't touch the coffee. "You said you don't think it was me," she said. "What does that mean?" Nathan leaned against the counter and crossed his arms, not defensively, just the way a man leans when he's going to say something he's already thought through. "It means the structure benefits someone who isn't you. If you built it, you'd have insulated yourself better. Whoever designed it left you exposed. You're the signature on the contracts, but the structure points somewhere else." Adrienne stared at him. Whatever she'd expected when she walked through that door, a capitulation, an apology, a name and a callback number, it was not this. The power she'd carried in with her was still technically present, but it had shifted into something she couldn't leverage. You couldn't buy what Nathan was telling her. You couldn't threaten it out of him. He wasn't negotiating. "You have documentation?" she asked. Nathan said he had enough to understand the architecture of it. He said he'd recognized the pattern the moment her company's name came up in a compliance thread he'd followed not recently, but about 8 months ago, when he was still paying attention to that world out of old habit. He'd looked into it the way people with a certain kind of background look into things they recognize, and what he found was enough to concern him. He hadn't done anything with it because it wasn't his problem to solve. "It's your problem," he said. "It's been your problem for at least a year. You just didn't know it was yours yet." Adrienne looked down at the counter. For the first time since she'd walked in, she wasn't looking at him. The card she'd pulled back was still in her hand, and she set it down slowly. Not as an offer this time, just as something she wasn't using anymore. The thing about power, Nathan had come to understand, was that it worked until the moment someone showed you what it was actually sitting on. Adrienne Blake had walked into a diner to retrieve control of a small situation, and instead, she was now sitting on a stool at a counter in a worn-out diner at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, learning that the company she ran, the one she had built into a $100 million operation through 15 years of calculated, disciplined work, had been used as the structural shell for something she had never authorized and could not explain. Her name was on it. That was the part that had gone out of her legs. "If this is real," she said, and her voice was steady in the particular way that voices go steady when the alternative is falling apart, "then whoever built it is still inside my organization." "Yes," Nathan said, "and they've had a year." "At least," he said. Adrienne looked up at him. The coldness that had been in her face when she walked in was still there, but it was a different kind of coldness now. Not the cold of someone who controls the temperature of a room, but the cold of someone standing outside in it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Nathan picked up the cloth again, folded it once, and set it on the counter. He said, "Because you walked in here like you owned the place, and you don't. And I thought you should know what you actually own." She sat with that for a long moment. The coffee in front of her had stopped steaming. The diner had settled back into its low background noise. Derek moving quietly in the kitchen, the hum of the overhead lights, the occasional sound of traffic from the street outside. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly as it had been before she walked in, except that Adrienne Blake was now sitting on a diner stool at 9:30 on a Tuesday night with the specific, airless feeling of someone who has just discovered the floor beneath her isn't as solid as she built her life, assuming it was. She had two options, and she knew it. She'd known it from the moment Nathan finished his last sentence, even if she'd spent the following silence convincing herself there might be a third. There wasn't. There never was, not really when the situation was this clear. She could walk out, go back to the car, tell herself this was a waiter with partial information and an inflated sense of his own relevance, and handle Thursday and the reservation and all of it through the usual channels. Her lawyers were good. Her PR team was better. She had managed difficult situations before. She knew how to contain things. The other option was harder. It required her to admit to herself and to the man standing across the counter that she had been operating inside a structure she didn't fully control, and that the people who built that structure had been counting on her not to look too closely. "How much do you actually have?" she asked. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has stopped performing and started calculating. Not in general. Specifically, Nathan said he had documentation he'd pulled from public filings, carrier registration records, rate schedules, cross-referenced against the declared customs values on the Northern Corridor shipments. Taken alone, none of it was conclusive, but matched against the internal contract structure, which he'd seen referenced in an industry compliance forum before the thread was taken down. The picture was clear enough that a federal auditor looking in the right direction would find it inside of 2 weeks. Adrienne absorbed that. "The thread was taken down," she said. "Yes," Nathan said. "Someone noticed it. But you'd already read it." "I'd already read it." She looked down at the counter again. The matte black card was still sitting there where she'd set it face down unused. She thought about the people in her organization who had access to the Northern Corridor contract. She thought about who had brought the third-party carrier arrangement to her as a done deal, already structured, already signed at the subsidiary level, presented to her as a routine cost-efficiency measure. She thought about the name attached to that presentation and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the diner. "If I do nothing," she said, "and this surfaces on its own through an audit, through a regulator, through anything my name is on the contracts, there's no version of that where I come out clean." Nathan said nothing. She wasn't asking him. She was thinking out loud, which was something he suspected that Adrienne Blake rarely allowed herself to do in front of another person. "And if I try to remove it, quietly, restructure the contracts, replace the carrier, close the gap, whoever built this will know I found it. And I don't know yet how many people are involved." She looked up at him. "Do you?" Nathan said he didn't. He said the architecture suggested at least 2 people with internal access, one with authority over subsidiary contracts, one with visibility into customs documentation. Whether there were others was something only an internal audit could determine. And that audit would need to happen in a way that didn't announce itself before it had what it needed. Adrienne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You walked away from this industry. You've been here for 3 years. Why?" It was the first personal question she'd asked him since she walked in. Nathan considered it without any visible resistance. He said the industry rewarded people who could look at a compliance gap and calculate whether the risk of exposure was lower than the cost of fixing it. He said he'd been good at that calculation. He said there came a point where being good at something stopped being a reason to keep doing it. Adrienne looked at him steadily. "And you think I'm like that?" "I think you didn't build the gap," Nathan said. "I already told you that. What you do now is the part that matters." She sat with that. Then she picked up the card from the counter, turned it over once, and set it back down. "I need the documentation you have, all of it. And I need the name of whoever ran that compliance forum, or the closest thing to a name you have." Nathan said he could put together what he had. He said he'd need a few days, and he said it would come with no conditions attached, not to her, not to the company, not to anything. He wasn't looking for a position, he wasn't looking for compensation. He was giving her information that was accurate, and what she did with it was entirely her business. Adrienne studied him with the particular attention of someone trying to locate the angle and failing. "Everyone has a reason," she said. "Sure," Nathan said. "Mine is that someone built something dishonest inside a system I used to work in, and they built it carefully enough that it's going to hurt someone who probably didn't deserve to be the one holding it when it fell apart. That bothers me. That's the whole reason." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a single small nod, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The nod of someone who had received information they couldn't dismiss and had decided to stop trying. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked out without another word. The driver was already at the curb. The black car pulled away, and the diner went back to being what it always was. What followed in the next 3 weeks was not dramatic. That was the thing about real institutional damage fixing. It didn't look like anything from the outside. Adrienne retained an outside legal team to conduct an internal audit, framed as a routine compliance review ahead of a contract renewal cycle. She did it without disclosing the actual reason to anyone above the subsidiary level. Nathan sent what he had through a channel. Her outside counsel provided no names, no return address, just the documents organized the way someone with compliance training would organize them. Clean annotated, cross-referenced. The legal team understood what they were looking at within 48 hours. What the audit found was specific and deliberate. 2 senior managers inside Blake Consolidated's logistics division had structured the Northern Corridor arrangement without full board authorization, routing it through a subsidiary entity that existed in the company's corporate structure largely as a legacy, holding the kind of entity that doesn't draw attention because it's been there so long nobody asks about it anymore. The rate manipulation had been generating undisclosed third-party payments for 14 months, funneled in a way that kept the numbers below the threshold that would trigger automatic internal review. It was careful work, the kind of careful that takes someone who knows exactly where the edges are. Both managers were removed. The subsidiary contracts were unwound and restructured with a new carrier under standard documented terms. The customs compliance gap was closed before any external regulator identified it, which meant it was handled as an internal correction rather than a violation. Adrienne's attorneys described it to the board as a proactive governance initiative. She did not issue a public statement. She did not call a press conference. She sat in her office on a Thursday morning, the same Thursday she'd originally wanted the diner for, and signed the restructuring documents one by one, and when she was done, she sat alone in the room for a while before she called her next meeting. Nathan heard nothing from her for 6 weeks after he sent the documents. He didn't expect to. He kept his evening shifts, kept his routine, kept the same pace behind the counter. Derek stopped watching him from the kitchen window. The regulars kept coming back for the coffee and the honest food, and the lights kept humming, and the diner kept being there. Then, one evening near the end of October, the front door opened, and Adrienne Blake walked in. No coat this time, a plain jacket, a bag over one shoulder, no driver visible through the window. She walked to the counter, sat down on the same stool she'd sat on 6 weeks earlier, and looked at the handwritten specials board above the register. Nathan came over without any particular expression and said, "What can I get you?" Adrienne looked at the board for another second, then said, "Coffee, and whatever the soup is tonight." Nathan wrote it down on a ticket and clipped it to the wheel above the kitchen window. He poured the coffee and set it in front of her. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way people do when the warmth is the point, and not just the coffee, and she didn't say anything for a while. Neither did he. When the soup came out, she ate it. She didn't make calls. She didn't open her bag. She sat at the counter of a diner on the corner of Mercer and Fifth and ate soup and drank coffee like someone who had, for the first time in a long time, nothing to manage in that particular hour. Before she left, she put the money on the counter exact amount plus a tip that was generous without being a statement, and she said, "It's good soup." Nathan said, "It's always been good soup." She picked up her bag and walked out. The bell above the door made its small, ordinary sound. Nathan cleared the bowl, and the cup wiped down the counter in long, even strokes, and moved on to the next thing. Not everyone who holds power actually controls everything beneath it, and not everyone who stands in a lower position is without strength. Respect doesn't come from a title or a bank account. It comes from the way a person holds their own values steady when the pressure to abandon them is at its highest. Sometimes the right "no" said at the right moment doesn't just change one life, it forces everything around it to shift.